All right, well, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor and Senior Scientist Kelly Kincher. Got a lot of his degrees, all of your degrees here from KU. Been part of our community a long time. He is a professor in the Environmental Studies program, teaches a lot of important and interesting courses on plants. And he's a senior scientist here at the Kansas Biological Survey and Center for Ecological Research, and has long been part of the Kansas Natural Heritage Program. So today he's going to tell us about his area of expertise in edible plants of the prairie. Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you. Great to be here. You know, as when people have encouraged us at the survey to share our work, and that comes back to haunt you, right? Because then you get on the list. So that's timely for me too. So I'm going to speak here a little bit so that people can hear me out there. If you can't hear out there, send a message, send a chat. All right. So I want to share information with you today in the realm of ethnobotany and my lab, which is part of the Heritage Program, involved in all sorts of plant things. I'm going to focus today on our ethnobotany work, and I'm glad to have people here from the lab, including Lisa Castle, Megan Whidden, and Kahita Barnowski back here. So you know who we are. It's been particularly important for me to look at conservation of prairies, sites in our region by looking at the plants. And then looking at the uses of plants has been a major vein of my work over the years, in part because I think if we can have people collect more to plants, they will connect more to the indies, the habitats, the ecosystems, vegetation communities that support them. So that's a lot of where I'm coming from. And then I'm fascinated by plants. So you get to hear plant stories and things I've had the opportunities to work on. And I like sharing things that people aren't thinking about. So I'm delighted that milkweeds are getting so much attention now as pollinator species, but people don't realize that they are a food. In fact, they're a Kansas food. When I visit friends, colleagues in the Potawatomi Reservation, Iowa Reservation, Omaha Reservation, Winnebago Reservation, Nebraska, all of them talk about milkweed soup. And to make milkweed soup, you pick the young flower buds, like these little thin ones up here, or the very young shoots. You boil them, and it makes great tasting food. In fact, the young tender leaves are one of the sweetest vegetables I know. And of course, most of you probably know that milkweeds are poisonous, right? And so, you know, what about that, right? Cultures, people are really smart. You know, tomatoes, potatoes are poisonous too, right? If I had you over for dinner and I served up a mess of tomato greens, you know, would you eat them? We know you don't eat tomato leaves, right? If you are connected to plants and land here, you know that you cook, you boil your milkweed. Many people say you should drain it to get rid of the cardiac glycosides, but a friend, colleague did some work on this and was working with the Miami people, and they said you don't really need to do that. He got good data that by just boiling the cardiac glycosides, the latex, the white milky sap, that it lowers those toxic compounds level that really don't affect humans. So traditional ecological knowledge already had that in its body of knowledge. I've had the opportunity to work with many tribes. A little project I'll just barely mention is work with the National Park Service. We got to put in signage at the Lewis and Clark Center in Omaha, Nebraska. Omaha has done very little to recognize that the name of their city is from the Omaha people. So this was some of the first signage that went in. So we worked with the Omaha tribal nation, the public school, which had a language program, and got names for plants that we could put on signage, which will be installed. If you go to Omaha downtown, the north side of downtown is a wonderful bridge across the river, a hike bike trail. Next to that is the National Park Center. So there's Lewis and Clark Center in the regional headquarters. I just published or republished my book. This is the new edition of the book that I actually wrote about 40 years ago, close to that. And a couple of years ago, I got a call from the University Press where it's published, and the editor said, "Have you thought about doing a new edition?" And I said to her, you know, I'm pretty happy with the original edition. I'm doing other things. I turned them down. But over that next month, I got to thinking, it's like, Well, I've learned some things in the last 35 years. There aren't major plant species I didn't know about, but there's a lot of minor plant species. Then I started looking at the text, and there's things I really wanted to update, things like I just said Indians, I'd say Native Americans now. There are things that were sexist or racist, some of which was quoting other material that didn't need to be there. Lewis and Clark called Sacagawea squaw. Well, that doesn't need to be in the quote. So, those sort of things, you can just change the quote, excise that little part, and people won't be bothered by that quote because it's all about eating Jerusalem artichoke, tubers. It's not about the name that Lewis and Clark gave her, and don't know the context for that name. It meant something probably different to them than it might mean today. So anyway, I've pulled together this information, documented a lot more species being used, and feel this is a way to both honor traditional ecological knowledge, but also give all of us prairie plant enthusiasts stories. I think stories is where it's at in terms of connecting the public and others the value of plants. So I'm keen on both of those. And of course, we have great local prairies. If you haven't been out to the Aikens Prairie southeast of town, it's a gem. You should go sometime. It's a conservation easement by the Kansas Land Trust. Needs milkweed, 200 species plus are out there. Don't need to tell you all about grasslands and prairies, but we're in the prairie bioregion. And so when I write about edible plants, I focus just on prairie species. I didn't write about trees. I didn't write about weeds like dandelions and on these sort of things that were used as food. I wanted to focus on the prairie to get people to think about the prairie. And of course, we've gone from large areas of grasslands to mostly cropland. And of course, prairies need management, and we need involved people in that management. I'm making the pitch, we need involved people in eating and self-medicating using herbal products from prairies as another way to connect people. So it's not just we need to manage, we need to use them and use them in a way that's sustainable, in a way that's thoughtful, in a way that actually encourages them to be protected. You involve people in places, you're more likely to see good outcomes from that. I like sharing this story. Hopness or groundnut, bean family plant, Apios tuberosa, probably is the most important wild food of tribal nations before corn, beans, and squash were introduced, although Lisa and I might argue about prairie turnips, and I did include a picture of prairie turnips in the slideshow for you. But important plant, and most people don't know it, but Topeka is named after it. Topeka means a good place to grow this species of plant, identified by most tribes around here as doe or toe. So Topeka is a good place to grow these tubers. And the plant's habitat is wet prairie. So in the floodplains, been documented abundant. Plant was abundant. Also, most of our floodplains are plowed. Most of our wet prairies are gone. It's also, being a bean family plant, was loved by livestock. So it's been grazed out too. This is a picture of the tubers. They're rather productive. There's also a little rhizobium bacteria balls there in the roots. You can find them when you pull them up. They grow well in the garden, and the tubers have really starchy root, bean or peanut flavored root. Really pretty productive. There's been a little bit of work on it for a crop, but majority of work now going on this species, which is native only to the United States and Canada, is in Japan. Japanese are more interested in it. So like many of our prairie plants, echinacea is an example of this too, more interest other places in the world than here, which is kind of sad. We grow it also at the medicinal plant garden. It has beautiful flowers, so it's ornamental. You can see the leaves there too. Okay, so lots to talk about, recognize the people here before. Well, there's many people here before, and many people here before claim this area as home. This is off the Osage's webpage. This is their definition of their territory. So we're in the land of the Osage and the Kaw and the Pawnee, and I'll even make a case for the Rick right here in a minute. These were the areas they used and lived, and part of their cultural stories. I have a project with the Osage. We're doing an ethnobotany project, probably result in another book for the tribe, for the people there, looking at all the plants they used and looking at historical information of those uses. A lot of my work related to the Osage Project and others has been doing historical work. Melvin Gilmore was a famous ethnographer, ethnobotanist, who interviewed lots of people in the 1920s, 30s, and before. And unfortunately, probably because a museum person may have inadvertently poisoned himself with curating substances, but ended up with Parkinson's disease later in his life. And although he published quite a bit, he didn't finish publishing a lot of his work. He did publish this work, which is still out there, little hard to use, old names, but fascinating read if you're interested in learning more about our local plants. So I had the opportunity through sabbatical, through some grant funding, to track down all of Gilmore's notes. And a particular big piece of those notes, which I became aware of, was with the Arikara people, who are now on Fort Berthold Reservation in North Dakota. But before, when Lewis and Clark met them on the Missouri River there in South Dakota, and then actually the Arikara were part of the Pawnee, living in Kansas and Nebraska up until about 13 or 1400 AD when they decided to move north. So I went through all of Gilmore's papers and notes, and this is just a typical field notebook page, which I copied or photographed, about 5,000 pages of material. It's now really nice. You can take this as, you know, an image and scan it, make use of it. Really, really helpful. And of course, I think it was typed at the time. I can scan, make a PDF, and search. So I took all this information, and we've been using it in ethnobotany database. We have a database we've created with information from notes and from the Native American ethnobotany database that's online. So it's information that Gilmore found for tribes across the region. Again, talking about with the Omaha, you have these plants. This is not Bazinga. And I have realized over the last couple of years that we all need to be learning Native American names for plants. I want to encourage you to do this. We shouldn't be in the perspective of, oh, the Omaha, the Kaw, or the Osage, they should keep their language. If we want that language to exist, we need to use it too. And it should be cool. Think about, you know, some of us know maybe some French words or something, right? It's kind of like a cachet to that, right? So I think we need to be learning some plant names. And I will say some of them here today as my effort to do that. And even some of the common names for plants could be native names. We have a lot of bad common names. So Gilmore not only interviewed people, he collected things. This is a choke cherry pounder. Choke cherries were eaten extensively. They're the major fruit across the region. But one of the things that's interesting about that, choke cherry fruits are small. There's not a lot of flesh, but they would dry them and pound them up, pits and all. And Gilmore not only documented this choke cherry pounder that's used traditionally, but he also collected the patties. These are in the Smithsonian. And if you zoom in on these, you can kind of barely see it. There's white flecks there. That's part of the choke cherry pit, all pounded up. And as a food, and I've had wojapi, which is the Lakota equivalent fruit soup using choke cherries, it's gritty. A little bit like eating an old-fashioned pear, the grit cells. So you eat it a little bit differently, flavorful. Probably does a good job of cleaning out your intestines too on the edges. All that Arikara material came through when I first learned about it. Something that's changed in kind of my world is I realized I needed Arikara collaborators to use this material. Let me the right way to do that. So I contacted Michael Yellowbird, who was a former director of the Indigenous Studies program here at KU. He was at Humboldt State. He's now Dean of Social Welfare at the University of Manitoba. And I said, got this information, we should do a collaborative project here. So we should include my brother, Lauren Yellowbird, who worked for the National Park Service as an interpreter of cultural items. And then Logan Sutton joined us, who is the expert on Arikara language. So we put all that together and ended up having this book that we published, and which we also got some funding to give copies free to both elders and youth on the reservation. This book also is available for free as a PDF online. They're really good about that. Out of that project, we made a map. This is a map I think is really interesting to think about. This is the gathering territory of the Arikara. As you look at this map, the triangles are documented archaeological sites of the Arikara. So I said they moved north from Nebraska about 13 or 1400 AD, and these are known village sites of theirs. The white square is the Fort Berthold Reservation. So they were repeatedly moved north in reservation era, and so they're all the core group. Not everybody lives, of course, in the reservation, but is in North Dakota. There's good published literature that collecting range for people of plants for food, animals, is typically within 25, 30 miles, meaning that's a little far almost to go for a whole day, but it's kind of the extent that someone could go out and collect things and bring them back to the village site. And that's where you see the darker purple. And then there's more plants that are just beyond that that were collected. And then the fun thing for me botanically is looking at the list of auriferous species, you find that they used conifers. And those conifers, the closest location is in the Rocky Mountains of Montana or Wyoming. So that map extends all the way west. And they used some eastern deciduous forest herbal plants in rich forests into Minnesota. And they also traded with the Osage for bowwood, Osage orange. Osage orange is really only native to the intersection of Arkansas, Oklahoma, Texas. So there was trading going on, which brought them downstream. So I think this is interesting to conceptualize that people had these ranges of territories that they collected and knew, and of course they traveled even further. I'd have a prairie turnip picture for Lisa, but been working with this plant. Tipson is what I like to call her. Timson La is the Lakota name. Again, Gilmore collected these. This is a collection of the Auricera tubers in the Smithsonian. All these plant materials at the Smithsonian are now ripe for additional work. If you want to do DNA work, and I'll make an example of that in a minute, that material or tiny bits of that material are available, much like with herbarium here. There's prairie turnips, which are said to point to each other. So moms, when they dug them, the American moms would tell their kids to go out and find the next one because they planted to each other. They were a family. That allowed moms to use their digging sticks and have the kids out of the way, and the kids would find them. They're still eating this food. Hardly anyone knows them. I've had an opportunity to spend time on the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota. These were harvested in South Dakota. These are the dried tubers. They're pounded up. They're another bean family plant, but used as flour, thickener. A buffalo stew would have had prairie turnips as a thickener in that, and probably other wild vegetables. Chokecherries, wild plums. I'm very fond of wild plums, probably my favorite fruit. A pitch I make is a lot of us are involved in prairie restoration. We have a pretty narrow palette on that. For those who've been involved in prairie restoration, how many of you planted plums as part of that mix of plants? Typically, we don't like woodies, do we, in planting prairies. We want wildflowers and some diversity of forbs. We don't think about woody plants. Plums are part of the prairie. They're a native species. In our restoration sites, we should be putting them at least on the edge. Chokecherries too, where chokecherries occur, and other woody plants. I love plums. I love plum jelly. I would be more likely to go to a restoration site if plums were ripe. And and sometimes they're abundant. This is the sandhill plum, classic sandhill plum, Prunus angustifolia. It's out around Quivira. If I'm doing field work and I drive by that on the road, it's a little time out. I'm gonna, and they're easy to process. You get great plum pulp, plum pudding, plum sauce. So we need to plant plums, right? That should be part of our prairie list of plants to use. Most of us, though, would plant like bee balm in a restoration site. And this is a very important plant, Wape washtema. Fragrant plant. The smell of the plant has great meaning to many of the tribes. We're now working on a project I'll tell about with using native names for plants. Typically, Native Americans had kind of a one-to-one correspondence to what we consider species. Not exact. Native Americans didn't have names for maybe all the grass species we might view today. Certainly not all the sedge species. Those might be more lumped, so they weren't as useful, but also cuts the other way. The Pawnee had 4 names for this one species of bee balm, all based on scents, smells, things that were important to them. So we've been giving thought to this idea of native taxonomy and the congruence and also differences from Western science taxonomy. story I like about this one, my friends up on the Omaha Reservation say that the bee balm, the smell of bee balm made into a pomade that you might put on your hair, your shoulders, attracts women. So not enough people probably using that today. Anyway, this is up in the Potawatomi Reservation. Went out and everyone loves to collect bee balm. Great pollinator plant too. Mentioned Jerusalem artichokes. Have edible tubers, easily propagated, been cultivated. If any of you grow them in the garden, you know they're kind of dangerous. They'll spread and can take over things, but they're really, really prolific. They are full of inulin as a carbohydrate source, which is slow digesting when you eat it. So they've been recognized as good food for diabetics because don't get a big sugar rush from them. But it also means they're not fully digestible. So some people call them fartichokes. The Omaha name translates as the food for homeless boys. And I wonder that's before or after they eat them. Okay, I mentioned a lot about native names. We've just gotten a really nice grant that Lisa, Megan, and George Growing Thunder, who I don't believe is here today, are working on. And for that, we're looking at the USDA plants database. Any of you use that a little bit? Use that some? It is the source for figuring out scientific names and associated information. So we're essentially going to be adding this ethnobotany tab. And that ethnobotany tab is going to be about adding ethnobotany, but native names, native uses to the plant. Christine Taliga is the main person we're working with there. We're really relieved to have a Zoom call with her last week in which we are still funded. She actually had to sign an affidavit personally that our project was not about DEI, not about climate change or other things. And it's not directly. And she said, and this is rightly so, there's a trust, relationship, responsibility of the federal government to tribal nations. This is important information for everybody. But I'm relieved that our funding, at least for now, is still in place. So the plants database, you can find it online, just type in USDA plants database, but it's standardized information for individual species, has names, taxonomy, great maps if you want to scroll down to those. It tells the area where they're found, wetland designations, those sort of things. It also has some ethnobotany already. There's guides to some plants. Kat Anderson, an ethnobotanist, worked on those a lot, and she's someone I've gotten to know personally and was able to get her a postdoc here at KU years ago through the Hall Center. So there's a whole list of culturally significant plants that are already on the USDA website. We're going to add some more information. So in this case, here's information on iris, wild iris of the West. Also, milkweed has some information that's not up there, but this type of things we're hoping to add. These are information from databases, but our most important part is we're now just starting to work out some contracts to work with tribal nation language programs to work with them to get their native names and some uses up on this database. So we're just engaging on that right now. So again, you'd have like common milkweed would also get the ethnobotany tab with information that we would populate it by tribe, tribal names, and other ethnobotany. And we're looking at developing what this site might look like, but we're also planning on getting sound clips of those names. Again, maybe the public could learn some of these names as a way to help keep these languages alive. Okay, so we've had a long history of work on medicinal plants at KU, here with our native medicinal plant program. At times we've had massive spreads of plants we've dried and ground. It's our grinder, and working with the medicinal chemistry department, getting the material for analysis. The highlight of that a plant I want to talk about are ground cherries, which is a pretty poor name. So I like calling them wild tomatillos because people now know tomatillos. But this is the same genus, closely related species that have wonderful fruits. You may know them also as husk tomatoes, little berry on the inside. Pretty good sized when ripe. Well, it's interesting. We worked on about 200 different species native to Kansas and the Great Plains for their medicinal constituents. Again, I mentioned we dried lots of material. We found interesting compounds and published on this plant. With analides was a group of compounds that we found new compounds within. But one of the curious things about this plant is it scored higher than any other plant we tested for antioxidants. You may know antioxidants is vitamin C. They're also really known as preservatives. So had these fruits, and we realized that the, the value of these compounds were their anti-cancer compounds. So the medical center worked with us, and there was great interest in them for a while. When it looked very promising, they did cause tumor size reduction. So again, this is like potatoes, tomatoes, it's a poisonous plant. Tomatillos are poisonous plants, but the fruits are edible, like tomatoes, peppers, etc. So we really wanted to know if the edible fruits had these compounds. And so picked a bunch of the fruits, we grew them at the medicinal plant garden, and I learned that when we picked them, they were green, and laid them out in room 8 of Uguchi Hall, and they didn't dry. It was over a month, and they were still just green, round fruits. They were starting to get yellow and get better color. So we cut them in half. That's what you see here. And then they did start to dry. And I put that together. It's like, well, whoa, these have strong antioxidants. Antioxidants are preservatives. So those fruits were being preserved, and that's why they had such difficulty drying. The power of those fruits, we actually had discussions with General Mills and Kellogg's about helping them develop a natural antioxidant perhaps from these. We did not get funded for that. We did get funded by Kellogg's for some of our nutritional plant work. But there was really consideration of needing to develop a better preservative for food because BHA, BHT are already banned in Europe, and that probably will happen here at some point. Okay, moving forward, so we've done a lot of this work out at the medicinal plant garden, and it's been a really delightful experience to have that piece of property as part of the field station. When we first started our project work, it was just endowment land around the airport, and had the opportunity to pick a piece of property that really had great soil, being in the river valley. And so with grant funding primarily and a little bit of support from KU, we developed the infrastructure there that provided water and provided opportunity to what we're doing. I'm showing this picture because a new project we're doing is looking at seed oils in echinacea. And there's a firm in Oklahoma that's contracted with us to do this experimental work. And their interest really is coming from the business side, in that they have some sort of new processing equipment that allows them to extract oils without heat or chemicals. So I'm guessing pressure, but so that they have really high quality oils. And they've been working with the pecan industry in Oklahoma, looking at other uses of oils, and contact me about echinacea oil. So it's like, well, I've done a lot of work on echinacea. I've written a book on echinacea, and there's virtually no literature, although we've, with Lisa's help and Megan's help, we found some, but there's virtually no literature on echinacea oil. And has not been much of a thing. But their hope, and now their interest in this, is as a massage oil, or I didn't even know about this, Harley, but there's people who do lymphatic drainage treatments. So they've got some Santa Fe spas that are doing treatments for lymphatic drainage, which apparently is helpful if you post-cancer or have other health issues to get your fluids moving in your body. Even so, you can imagine massage oils, those sort of things, having this echinacea oil. The oils do have a tiny bit of tingle in them. Echinacea, as you know, if you've ever chewed on the root, will numb your tongue a little bit from compounds in it that are related to Novocaine. And then, of course, echinacea is an important immune stimulant. I don't know the value of this ultimately. It could be hype, you know, echinacea's kind of got this cachet to it, but we're interested in it. So we're growing this. We decided to set this up on an experimental basis. So they're curious which species would be best for them in terms of production. So we're growing Echinacea angustifolia, purpurea, and pallida. Purpurea is the common garden cultivar. If you grow Echinacea, you're likely growing that species. So we thought, okay, let's get a standard variety, and we ordered the Magnus variety, which is kind of the biggest purple flowered traditional cultivar been used for years. There's even other published literature on it. And then we also did a treatment involving mycorrhizae, which we don't have results on all that yet, but to our surprise and shock this summer is that this picture shows our purple cone flowers weren't all purple. And we called the seed company and checked and all this, and I thought maybe there were just a couple seeds of new varieties that had dropped in, but we ended up with quite a few plants that were not the regular purple coneflower. The flower shape was the same. So I've been involved in seed collection for Echinacea years ago, and Iowa State has a seed bank, corn seed bank, other banks, and they're the repository for Echinacea seeds. And the thought going into that collection process is that with Echinacea's herbal product interest, that those seeds would be used perhaps to develop varieties of Echinacea that might have even more immune stimulating compounds or other helpful things. But the greatest interest in that collection has been from the horticulture industry for flowers. And so most Echinaceas are purple cone flowers, but there's one species that is called Echinacea paradoxa. And it's a yellow flowered species. And of course, how can you have a yellow flowered purple coneflower, right? It doesn't make the paradox, right? So anyway, that species has been used a lot in the breeding efforts more recently to give these wonderful colors of plants of them. And of course, whites occur in nature for most purple flowered species. Genetically, you get a handful of things that are white. So I've been mixing all these colors. The plants themselves, the flowers still have the Magnus look, but our current thought, we're still debating this, is probably there's cross-pollination between Magnus and some of these fanciful colored varieties. Anyway, we're just got our first year of growth in that. Next year, we're going to harvest. We already know from first year yields that the Echinacea purpurea is quite a bit higher yielding. So if they're looking and getting seeds, purpurea probably would be the best choice. Backing up to the physalis, I didn't finish this. This is the map. Again, with the wild tomatillos, we recognize, again, there's this tremendous food source that was out there. The green map is the range of physalis species. Hard to tell them apart in terms of historical literature, in terms of what's in the ethnobotany. So they've lumped together here. The numbers in the slide are about different tribes that use them as food or medicine. And the stars are just a few of the archaeological sites where the seeds are found. In fact, most archaeological sites, if there's a hearth or cooking area as part of that archaeological site, you're likely to find wild tomatillo seeds, along with chenopodium seeds, lamb's quarters, and amaranth seeds. They are all used extensively as food, particularly the wild tomatillos are again used in sauce. The reason you find things around hearth is if something gets charred, it won't rot. If it gets completely carbonized. And in the Great Plains where we live, food material left out is going to rot or spoil. Archaeology is much easier in the Southwest where you have caves and very dry climates because things survive, but here things don't survive unless there's special treatments to them. So charring them, making them charcoal, but still retain the shape so you can identify them, it's been very, very helpful. And of course, humans have a long history of cooking over fires and burning things, right? How many of you burned food when cooking, you know? Well, that helps preserve it, right? So in doing this work and doing the Smithsonian work, so talking about this is another Smithsonian collection of some of the problems you deal with. This identified as Physalis lanceolata. Physalis lanceolata doesn't occur in Nebraska, Kansas, or the region, so we know it's a misidentification. I think it's probably the long-leafed Physalis or Physalis longifolia. We don't know for sure. But this collection's in the Smithsonian. Smithsonian would allow someone to do work on it. I believe, Craig could correct me, but I don't think Physalis has been worked out very well yet in terms of its genetic structure and DNA work, but it can and will be at some point in time. So it'd be possible to actually identify what species of root this is at the Omaha we're using as a wound medicine. Wouldn't surprise me again, with these antioxidants and helpful materials in the plant materials could be in the roots and could be helpful for wounds. Favorite food here, right? The fruits of cactus are very tasty. Problem with them, of course, is not the big spines, but the little glochids, the short ones, which if you try to eat one of those and get those in your lip, and then they're barbed like fish hooks, so you can't just pull them out, they'll break off. Really lovely, right? But the easy way to deal with these, the native folks know, is pretty simple. You just hold them over the fire and you melt them off. They melt pretty easily, or over a burner if you're doing it at home. And then you get the really ripe fruits. The ripe fruits have nice juice, great for margaritas, by the way. That tastes a little bit like strawberry, watermelon. You can buy tunas, which is different species of prickly pear, commonly in Mexico, for its fruits. There's even fruit juices made of it. Okay, one other little realm here, wild onions and tubers. I'm really interested in tubers and corms and bulbs. One thing that I didn't know about, but it's been a more recent find for me, there's a long history of pit baking foods, of baking foods in big pits. You may know about this if you know anything about the camas, the wild camas in the Northwest, or even agave roasting pits in the Southwest. There's a technique, and I'll describe it, but we're now finding that pit baking occurred from Texas to Kansas with all sorts of bulbs, our wild camas bulbs, onion bulbs, all sorts of bulbs and other subterranean, starch-rich, carbohydrate-rich food material. And so the process is that you get your material that you want to bake, you have a big pit, maybe 5-10 feet across. You put rocks in the bottom, build a big fire on top of it, get lots of coals, heat those rocks up, put in your green material, leaves of something, weeds even, milkweed's used in some places to cook it too. On top of that, put all your root bulbs, more material on top, cover it, protect it, bury it, and it will bake for about 2 or 3 days. What you get are baked roots, but different than us baking typically in the oven, the slow baking over time converts more of the indigestible carbohydrates, the inulins, the other big molecular weight carbohydrates, into sugars. So you get a higher sugar content and something very sweet. So a lot of our root foods have a longer history of use. I kind of wonder why that didn't continue in the Great Plains. Certainly continued in the Southwest with agave, and continues to this day there, and in the Northwest with camas. Okay, one last little section here. Going back to restoration, that's a classic restoration project we did, Kansas City area, 40-acre cornfield. Here are our bags of soil. The trash cans have all the seeds we've collected in their metal cans, so the rodents don't get in them. Have a seed drill, going to drill all this material. We broadcast all the seeds, but we didn't think about, again, medicines, food being planted here. We were planting just our favorite list of prairie plants. I wish we'd done this. This is now in suburban Overland Park. It has houses on top of part of it, so it doesn't even exist, but we feel that if we would have planted this to more useful species, if we had planted the plums, if we had planted things that people harvest, it'd be more likely used. So I've got another grant this past year, which is a Plant, Pollinators, and People grant. Really, it's led by Susanna Lehrman, who's a faculty researcher at University of Massachusetts, but the Forest Service funded project in which this is the team of us, including Kahita. Here is one of the ORISE fellows that we funded through this program. It's a fellowship program through Oak Ridge National Labs. What we're doing is, this is a project for Region 9, so it's actually across the border into Missouri, up to Minnesota, and then to the East Coast, but particularly in the upper Midwest, is to partner with tribal communities in terms of thinking about restoration projects that need to happen, especially on Forest Service lands, in which there be greater interest in tribal nations in using them if they had plants that were more appealing to them. So actually involving tribal communities and their ethnobotany in what would be your plant list for doing restoration of open habitats. Admittedly, national forests were created for forests, for trees, but many of our national forests across the country have other habitats. So we have savannas, barrens, other open habitats that also people use a lot. And there's been very little attention to those habitats by the Forest Service. They've been focused on trees, right? But the Forest Service is much broader than forests and trees. So that's how this project got established. For that, we've been working on restoration database. A little too small to see, but we've got people in this room. This is a list of published papers on restoration projects. So I know Brian and Sarah, myself, Helen, there's projects all of you've done that have been tracked down just by searching the literature. So putting together the list of plants that have been used for restorations. And this also is to provide information and data. If someone's wanting to do a restoration in Wisconsin, what project has been done near you? You could find those. And also very interested in the list of species used for prairie restoration. We're also using the ethnobotany database again, so we want to get that list of plants that have been used in ethnobotany. And then thirdly, we're working on looking at pollinator species of plants and relating that to pollinators. The goal of this project, in part, besides helping Native folks get access to national forest sites to do restoration, is to combine the ethnobotany and restoration plants for pollinators and just use in general, so that you could combine those. So that if you are ideally doing a restoration site in central Missouri, or let's say in Wisconsin, if we can get the mapping part worked out, we will give you a list of plants that are native to where you're at, that are prairie plants, and we will highlight those that are pollinator species and highlight those that have traditional use for food, medicine, or other uses. So we're hoping that this database can be created through this project, if the project gets continued with funding, so that people can access it. Okay, wrapping this up, my pitch: we need to eat prairies. We need to make pie from prairies. We need to make jelly. We need to tell stories about our native food plants. And ideally, I think management should be, all of us involved in restoration, thinking about tending, managing, harvesting, eating, using, self-medicating plants from these sites. Thank you. Take questions. Any questions? Yeah, Bob.
First question about the milkweed. So they vary a lot in the particular carotenoids they have in them. And one of the features of common milkweed is that it's extremely low in the nasty. Is that the one that's favored for?
Almost entirely. Many of those species are just toxic. There's too many carotenoids in them, in the milky sap compounds. Also, the compounds are much lower, which kind of makes sense, in the emerging young shoots and also in the flower buds. So it's the older plant material that gets protected.
Primarily the common milkweed that's used.
Yeah, common milkweed, and then the Western equivalent, speciosa, in Western Kansas, but yeah.
So with sunchokes, I know they're like kind of like a terror for farmers if it's on their land based on what I've read about them. So would incorporating those in prairie restoration projects make it less attractive in the future if that land is getting bought up?
I don't know. I mean, when land I'm not sure I quite understand your question, but when land transitions, sadly, people don't typically respect the plant material on it, right?
I think I've read that sunchokes can come back for like years from tiny root fragments and make a lot more of those. So
yeah, so I've done a lot of work on several species that will come back from root fragments, be it wild tomatillos or osha, even echinacea will come back from roots, but that's really with minor disturbances. So harvesting out in a prairie, it can be sustainable if you know your species. Lisa and I and others worked on a publication on looking at how do I frame that? On which plants would be most at risk due to overharvest. And certainly things that resprout are much better. If you're collecting leaves of something, you're not going to harm the plant much. If you're digging up the root, there could be concern. If the root doesn't resprout, real big concern. We create kind of a matrix of characters that would affect things being at risk from too much harvest.
If you were going to Johnny Appleseed ground nut again,
Yeah,
so it was more widely spread like it
Yeah.
used to be.
yeah,
I think I've only seen it in a couple of places.
right.
So what would you do?
First of all, these are propagated. I always have some at home. I would take advantage of CRP program and pop just the tubers into any wet low ravine, any slightly wetland characteristic site.
So apple seeding would be best with the tubers and not seeds.
Yes, and then sadly, I mean, they're so focused on rhizomes and these sweller strings of tubers that many of them don't produce seed. Actually, are diploid, don't produce seed. Yeah, Jude.
We used to find wild tomatillo pretty common out of Northwest Kansas. Never knew much about it. But my understanding was that if you were going to eat it, you were supposed to wait until the fruit fell to the ground, basically, which is the same way we harvest our tomatillos too. Did you pick those very green, or what was the?
We picked them, they're inflated, and we thought when we first picked them, we thought they were ready to pick. But the thing about tomatoes is like this: if you pick your tomatoes green because they're big, they don't taste very good, right? So we are first picking them that way, and when they're picked at that stage, they have a lot more of the bitter compounds. They actually ripen, so you really do want them ripe or sweet. They're a little hard to find in the wild sometimes because other animals like them, eat them. There's also a curious worm, Heliotis species, I don't remember what it was, that it tunnels a hole in the paper husk, just the diameter of this little caterpillar, and goes in there and eats the seed. And you don't see that it's in there because it's just this tiny little hole that's as big as its diameter. And then we had a lot of our plants were infected by that. And I looked, and the main host for these is soybeans. They like to eat soybean leaves. So there we were in the river valley, and we had lots of pest problems. In fact, makes me want to say something about native plants. We're all proponents of native plants, but one of the advantages of native plants in the prairie is they're spread out. Whether it's milkweeds or wild tomatillos, being spread out keeps them from all being eaten up. We grew a big patch of them, almost the size of this room, in a municipal plant garden, and the fruit yield dropped a lot from when we grew them in our first row or two, and that's not an uncommon thing. Anyone else? Well, I'll be glad to hang around here a little bit, so if you have other questions, you can come up and visit with me. Thank you.